This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to look at Poison. Poison is an alternate win condition in Magic, one that made its debut in 1994's Legends. If a player has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. Between 1994 and 1996, Poison appeared on several cards, but it never really caught on in any meaningful way. The main problem was that all the cards that put poison counters on players only gave them one at a time, and this really made it difficult to ever win with Poison. Eventually, they tried different spins on Poison, including Poisonous in 2007's Future Sight, which came with a numerical value so you could get more than one counter at a time. Infect in 2010 Scars of Mirrodin block, which makes a creature do damage to players in the form of poison counters and to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. And then most recently we've seen Toxic in 2023's March of the Machine, which like Poisonous comes with a numerical value indicating how many poison counters the opponent gets when your creature hits your opponent. To be eligible for this video, a card had to have one of these poison mechanics or otherwise be capable of putting poison counters on a player. In all, there are 117 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Phyrexian Unlife. Every card in this list lets you put poison counters on your opponent, except this one. It uses poison counters in a more unique way. For 2 generic and a white, it's an enchantment, and it says, you don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. Obviously that's really strong, but it does come with a drawback. All damage is dealt to you in the form of poison counters. So while you might be able to go to negative life, once Unlife is in play you can only take 10 damage before you lose. It's kind of like it gives you 10 extra life, which would not make for a great card, but Phyrexian Unlife gets its power from its ability to help you combo off, in particular with Ad Nauseam, along which it has gained every single one of its points in Modern. Ad Nauseam lets you reveal cards from the top of your library and put each card into your hand. The downside is you lose life equal to the mana value of those cards, but if you have Unlife in play, you can draw your entire deck without worrying about dropping below 0, and then win the game with something like Lightning Storm. Ad Nauseam decks are still a thing in Modern, although they don't see insanely heavy play right now either. If you want a deeper dive on Ad Nauseam decks, I have covered them in my deck history series, so you should check that video out. At number 9, it's Viridian Corruptor. For 1 generic and 2 green, the Corruptor is a 2/2 with Infect, and when it enters the battlefield it destroys an artifact. The Corruptor has seen play in Infect decks in both Standard and Modern, but it's also seen significant play outside of that type of deck as a result of its ability to add to the board while destroying a problematic artifact. In both Standard and Modern, it was useful for dealing with the powerful Birthing Pod, as well as other artifacts. The Corruptor has also seen play in Legacy Infect, but it doesn't have any points anywhere since 2022, and in the long run it's likely to fall off this list. At number 8, it's Glistener Elf. For 1 green mana, you get a 1/1 with Infect. Of the various poison mechanics, Infect is the most powerful. Because your creature puts a poison counter on your opponent for each damage it does to them, this means buffing your Infect creatures can result in your opponent getting to 10 poison very quickly. If that's your goal, Glistener Elf is the 1-drop you're after. It saw a bit of play in Standard Infect decks, but Modern and Legacy are the formats where it's really been abused because there are no shortage of efficient ways to rapidly buff your creatures. In Modern, this is often accomplished with Scale Up or Might of Old Krosa, and in Legacy, you can throw Berserk into the mix. In both formats, it's entirely possible for Glistener Elf to give your opponent 10 poison counters on turn 2. Glistener Elf is going to keep putting up top 8s in both formats. As with Ad Nauseam decks, if you want to know more about Infect decks, that's another archetype I've done a deck history video on. At number 7, it's Tyrranax Rex. For 4 generic and 3 green, he's an 8/8 with Trample that can't be countered. He also comes with Haste, Ward 4, and Trample, and importantly for this list, Toxic 4. Obviously this is a huge, hard-to-kill threat that can come down and smash in for a ton of damage and poison out of nowhere. Trample combines nicely with Toxic because unlike with Infect, even if the Rex only tramples over for 1, you still get the full 4 poison counters. It sees significant play in Standard, both as a sideboard and main deck card in 4 and 5 color control decks. These decks can ramp into it using Invasion of Zendikar and Topiary Stomper, making it possible to bring this down on turn 4. In Pioneer, it's been put into play in Neoform decks, which can cast a cheap Hooting Mandrills and sacrifice it to Neoform to put this huge dino into play early. In Modern, it's ramped into an Amulet Titan, and in Legacy, you can cheat it into play with Natural Order in Elf decks. It's a pretty great threat against opponents who are reliant on spot removal, and it can threaten to kill your opponent with poison or damage quickly, so it's going to keep seeing play in all of those formats. At number 6, it's Blighted Agent. For 1 generic into blue, it's a 1/1 with Infect, and it's unblockable. That's obviously a nasty combination, as preventing opposing creatures from being able to block the agent means it represents some serious inevitability, especially if your deck is capable of buffing the agent to the moon, and obviously that's exactly what Infect decks do. It's gained all of its points in Modern and Legacy Infect, and it's going to keep seeing play in those formats too. At number 5, it's Skrelv, Defector Mite. For 1 white mana, it's a 1/1 artifact creature with Toxic 1, and he can't block. You can also pay 1 white Phyrexian mana and tap Skrelv to give another target creature you control Toxic 1 and hexproof from a chosen color until end of turn, and it can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn either. Basically, he's a toxic version of Mother of Runes. If Skrelv is untapped, he's incredibly good at frustrating your opponent and limiting their ability to interact with your board. Just the threat of activation is enough to alter the game in your favor. While Skrelv has seen his fair share of success in standard toxic decks, he also tends to be played in white aggro decks that don't really intend on poisoning the opponent, at least not as plan A. He's just a great 1-drop with utility all game long. The fact he's a cheap legendary creature also really matters in standard right now because of decks that use Plaza of Heroes. He's also played in Pioneer, generally in Aura decks that look to make creatures absolutely massive. The risk with that strategy is how bad it feels when your opponent destroys your huge creature, but Skrelv makes it so you don't need to worry about that so much. He's even got a single point in Modern, Death and Taxes, and he's well positioned to keep putting up top 8s, especially in Standard and Pioneer. At number 4, it's Etali, Primal Conqueror. For 5 generic and 2 red, this 7/7 comes with Trample, and when it enters the battlefield, each player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land, and then you can cast any number of spells from among those exiled non-land cards without paying their mana costs. So, Etali gives you 2 cards for free on top of giving you a huge body. You might be saying, wait, this card doesn't do anything with poison. But it does, actually, but only after you transform it. You can pay 9 generic and a green Phyrexian mana to do so, at which point it becomes Etali Primal Sickness, an 11/11 with Trample and Indestructible, and when it hits your opponent, they get poison counters equal to the damage. In other words, it has Infect. Obviously, getting the Phyrexian side going doesn't happen all that often, but that's mostly because the front side is often enough to win the game. So far, all of Etali's points have come in Standard. It was once played in Rakdos control decks that could cheat it into play with the cruelty of Gix. Some cards were banned out of that deck, so it's not around anymore, but Etali is plenty powerful even when you cast it normally as a control deck win condition, and that's what it's been doing since those bans. It's going to keep gaining points in Standard in the future. At number 3, it's Blightsteel Colossus, which should look a little familiar because Etali's Phyrexian side is modeled after it. For 12 generic mana, you get an indestructible 11/11 with Trample and Infect, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library. Infect on a creature this huge and hard to deal with is pretty awesome, and means you'll have no problem beating your opponent in a single swing. While they went to the trouble of making it so it's hard to reanimate Blightsteel Colossus, and this did make it hard for it to find traction in formats like Standard and Modern, it can still be cheated into play using other methods. In Legacy, artifact decks have done so with Koldatha Forgemaster or by using Metalworker to produce a ton of mana. He's also used in Sneak and Show, a deck that can use Show and Tell or Sneak Attack to put it into play early. Sneak Attack even gives him haste. In Vintage, there are no shortage of ways to cheat it into play, with Oath of Druids and Tinker the most common ways to do it. The Colossus has been played in a ton of Vintage decks as a result, as even Storm decks used to run Tinker and a Colossus as a backup win condition, leading to a huge score in the format. These days, though, the Colossus isn't seeing nearly as much play, largely because there are better things to cheat into play, like Atraxa, and Tinker is more frequently used to assemble combos instead. So Blightsteel might be done gaining points, at least at a significant clip. At number 2, it's Mirrex. This is a land with a sphere subtype, and it can tap for colorless mana. You can also tap it for 1 mana of any color, but only if Mirrex entered the battlefield this turn, and it has an ability that gets it on this list. You can pay 3 generic and tap it to make a 1/1 artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. This has quickly proven to be a great utility land, one worth playing in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. Unlike a lot of lands with nice abilities, it can even produce colored mana, even if it can only do it for a turn. But then, like all utility lands, it can eventually impact the game in a way other than by producing mana. Those mites might not be able to block, but they certainly add to the board. Mirrex has seen a lot of play in Standard, including in Toxic decks, but also in a wide swath of other decks, ranging from Azorius Soldiers to 5-color combo. No matter what kind of deck you're playing, it's nice to have a land around that can spit out creature tokens. It sees play in Pioneer too, although usually only in some very specific decks, like those built around Indomitable Creativity or Transmogrify. Both of these decks look to cheat scary creatures into play early by targeting tokens with their eponymous card. These will always hit your big threat if you have no other creatures in your deck, and cards like Mirrex help you do that, since you can use it to produce those tokens. It's also played in Modern Hardened Scales, which runs a whole lot of artifact payouts like Arcbound Ravager, so it can get some extra value out of those artifact creature tokens. Mirrex is very likely to continue to top 8 major events, but it has basically no hope of ever catching the number 1 card on this list, which is another utility land, and that card is Inkmoth Nexus. Not only is it a utility land, it's a creature land. While Mirrex can produce creature tokens, the Nexus can become a creature. Anyway, it's a land that can tap for colorless, and you can pay 1 generic to make it a 1/1 Blinkmoth artifact creature token with flying and infect until end of turn. So that's a really scary creature, because if you can combine it with some stats boost, this land can very easily just be your win condition. It ends up with such a high score because it's good in a ton of decks and not just infect decks. In Block and Standard, it was played in Tempered Steel decks, in which it was often a 3/3 when it became a creature. In Modern, it's also been a great place to put Arcbound Ravager's +1/+1 counters. More recently in Modern, it has also been played in Modern Hammer Time decks, which can quickly slap Colossus Hammer on the Nexus. You can equip the hammer and then use its ability to give it flying, which is a particularly devastating combo. Legacy is the only format where it's primarily featured in infect decks. Inkmoth Nexus is going to keep rapidly gaining points in the future, and it's hard to imagine Mirrex ever managing to surpass it. So, those are the top 10 poison cards in Magic. Do you want to poison your opponent? Check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos that look at other mechanics in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.